In this video, I will show you how to reinforce a mask made using plaster bandages for use as a clay press mold. We need these masks to be a little bit more durable to use them for the molding purposes. So let's get started. The materials needed include plaster. I'm using pottery plaster number 1, which works great for mold making. A mixing bucket, water, clay. We should be using water-soluble clay since that's what we will be pressing into the mold. A set of clay tools, newspaper or paper towels for cleanup, a plastic drop cloth, and optional would be a rasp shown on the right or a green Scotch-Brite scrubby. All right, so I have a sheet of plastic down that I'm going to be working on, and I'll put my mask on top of it. I'm going to seal this mask to that plastic, and so I need some clay to do that. These are 2 5-pound logs of clay, and I only need about a pound, just a little over a pound, so I'm going to take out one of the 5-pound logs. I'm going to just visually mark it at the halfway point, and then divide that in half again. And that way I can get a pretty good estimate of what about a pound of clay might look like. So first of all, after I cut this clay and set that pound of clay aside, I want to make sure that I seal this clay back up in the bag. If you don't, it will dry out. So make sure you seal it really well. Next, I'm going to look at my mask and see if I can see any light shining through any spots. And I've got a tiny little spot in one of the eyes. I'll be casting, press molding the inside and reinforcing it on the outside. So if any plaster can leak in, then I would have trouble. I'm going to just give myself a little Sharpie line and take the clay, the pound of clay, and start making a kind of coil along the inside wall. And this is because I want to seal this to the surface. And I did a pretty good job of getting an oval even all around my face, but you can see I had a gap in my chin and my forehead. So I'm going to make sure those walls are a little taller right in there. And I want that clay to fit inside of the head, and it was just a little too big, so now I'm readjusting by making it set in from the Sharpie line. Okay, now I can press it down gently, make sure it's sealed into place. I can start wiping some of the excess clay away. And I've slid a board under just so I can kind of show you what that looks like. There was that little gap at the bottom and at the top. And if there's any undercuts or areas where the clay doesn't seem like it's really sealing, I'll just add a little bit more clay there. And I'll use my wooden clay tool to kind of straighten out those edges. Because I'm making a press mold and I plan on making several pressings with it, I want to make sure that I have a good mold to work with. So these steps are important not to be too fast with. I just adjusted my timer there so you could sort of watch the time elapse as I'm working. I bumped it ahead 10 minutes because it's already been 10 minutes in this sped up world. Okay, so continue to clean that up until I feel like it's got a good seal. And then I'm just going to give myself another visual guide of the thickness of my mask. I just used 2 fingers and made some dots. You'll see in a moment how this might be useful to know where your mask is in relation to the plaster. Once you start working, it sometimes disappears under the plaster. And you might even, but it's not necessary, make a little coil of clay just as a reminder of where that Sharpie line is. 1.5 pounds of plaster is not going to be too much. It's not going to end up making our mask too thick, but this can be useful just as a secondary guide. So let's take a moment to talk about the pottery plaster mixing ratio. And this will be different for every kind of plaster you use, so make sure you read the instructions for the particular plaster. Pottery plaster number 1 is 3 parts plaster by weight in pounds to 1 part water by volume in quarts. In this demo, I already hinted that I am using 1.5 pounds of plaster, and so I will need a half a quart of water. I'm basically using half the amount that's listed on the left. My bucket does not have quarts, it has ounces. So the translation from quarts to ounces is 16 ounces of water. And you will want that water to be room temperature or 70 degrees. If your water is colder, it will take longer to set. If it is warmer, it will set much faster. You will see this chart throughout my demo, and this is time frames for mixing and setting plaster. Plaster goes through different stages as time passes, and so this is important to keep in mind, but it is also just a general guideline. If your water is warmer or cooler, those numbers will change. If your plaster is old, that also might change. So use this as a guideline, but also really pay attention visually to what you're seeing in the plaster as I am mixing it. So the first thing we do is add the plaster and then we let it soak. You always want to add plaster to water and you want to let it soak before you start mixing it. So I have my 1.5 pounds of plaster and I'm using a little yogurt container to sprinkle the plaster into the water, and I'm letting it dissolve into the water. You can see as I continue to add plaster that the plaster starts slowing down. At first it just disappeared, and now it's kind of floating at the top before it gets dissolved into the water. And this is good. We want all the little bits of plaster to be surrounded by water particles. And I want to make sure I'm getting all of the plaster. If you notice that you get a big mountain at the top and it's not dissolving within 30 seconds to a minute, you probably have the wrong ratio of plaster to water. Okay, my plaster has soaked for 3 minutes and now I'm going to start mixing. It says you should mix for 3 minutes, but it really again depends on your water temperature and your plaster. As you're mixing, make sure you're being really vigorous and getting all the way to the bottom and the sides of the bucket. We really want that plaster mixed well. It sometimes can be hard to tell the difference between the mixing stage and the liquid stage, but we want to continue mixing even through this liquid stage because it will be too runny for our purposes. You can see I've put it on and it's starting to run off the mask, and I'll end up wasting a lot of plaster if I use it in this liquid state. So I'm continuing to mix, and now I'm actually between liquid and Thixotropic. So it's got a little more volume to it. And you can also see that when I drag my finger through, it kind of leaves a little bit of a line or a little marking. So that is really great for starting to build with. It's runny, but it holds its place. So I'm continuing to build with it in that sort of between liquid and Thixotropic state, and look at how beautiful that is going onto the surface. And I'm smoothing it out, trying to avoid air pockets and any gaps or holes. And 1.5 pounds is not enough plaster, or it's just barely enough plaster for this mask. So you can see that I'm also careful that it's not running off of the edge. And so I kind of scrape it up off of the base and pick it back up and run it along the mask again. So this is Thixotropic. It's holding its shape, but if I wiggle my hand, it starts dripping. That's when you know you are at the Thixotropic state. That's still a really beautiful state for working with the plaster. It's holding its shape and it still allows me to work. Plastic state is also still okay for building with, and Thixotropic and plastic can also get a little bit blurry in terms of knowing when one begins and one ends. But you will know when you have gone too far into the next phase, which is the hardening cycle. Watch what happens with the plaster in my hand as I try to shake it. It doesn't really turn as liquidy, and it even kind of cracks and breaks when I've moved my fingers apart. I really don't have any time left to waste at this point, and it's usually best to just stop working with it once it gets to that hardening cycle, because you can actually end up damaging your mold because of that property where I showed you it kind of cracks the plaster, so it won't be as strong. So I'm just finishing up that little bit, and then I'm going to stop. You don't want to force the plaster beyond that hardening cycle. And then finally we have a heat cycle. So it will take about 10 minutes for the plaster to heat up, and it's about 30 minutes from the time I start mixing to the time it's ready to be turned over. So cleanup is really important. Again, we don't want any plaster to go down the drain. And so I'm using just a little bit of water and rinsing my hands, and I'm going to use newspaper to start cleaning this all out. And I actually use that entire, not the entire, but just that little cup of water and newspaper to clean my hands and my bucket before I take them into my sink to wash them. So you can see time has passed. While I was waiting for my mask to set, I just worked on that cleanup, so I wasn't tempted to touch it ahead of schedule. So I've jumped ahead some time. You can see on the timer it's 5 minutes ahead. And if you were paying attention, it's that 30 minutes from start to end here. I'm going to flip the mask over. Had a little sharp edge. The clay that's on the inside, I want you to save it and make sure you keep it separate from your other clay. Because it's come in contact with plaster, we can't use it to fire in the kiln. Plaster and clay don't mix in that way, but we can use it to make a test press mold. And I really should have pulled out the clay before I started doing this, because you're seeing that I'm getting plaster in it through the process. And what I'm doing is trying to scrape away those sharp edges. You can see that little sharp edge there. And I'm realizing now that the top of the mold got a little thin and my plaster was breaking off there. Okay, so I have a separate bag for the plaster clay now. And I'm continuing to just sort of clean it up and also see where I might have gone a little too thick or a little too thin on the mold. If you use clay tools for working with plaster, you need to wash them really well before you go back to using them with clay that will be fired in the kiln. So I found those thin spots up at the top. I want to be careful not to totally break everything as I'm trying to get away those thinner spots. Digging a little more clay out. And along these sharp edges, there's a couple things you can do. You can see I'm using my metal rib, but also the loop tool in your clay kit can work. There are better tools for these tasks if you have access to them. So a green Scotch-Brite Scrubby, which was on the optional list, could be good, or this rasp or Sureform. You can find these in the hardware section or in the tool section at the hardware store. It is for working with drywall, and it's kind of like a cheese grater. So it's got little teeth, and you drag them in that direction, and it smooths out the surface. But again, you can use your loop tools or your other clay tools. Just clean them really well before using with clay. And then I'm going to use my sponge and just a little bit of water to clean out the mold, getting any bits of extra plaster that want to fall off out of the way, getting some of that extra clay out of the way. And we'll want to wait several days before we use this as a press mold because we want the moisture to evaporate from the plaster. The reason we use plaster for making molds with clay is because clay is water-based and plaster absorbs moisture. And so when we press the clay into the plaster, it will pull the moisture away from the clay. And clay actually shrinks as it dries, and therefore it will shrink away from the mold and it will release. And I will explain more about this in another video, so look for that. At this point, I have decided that the thin spot on the top of my head is probably a little too fragile. When we go to press clay into the mold, it could end up breaking or cracking. I had some extra plaster bandages, and so I'm just going to use the plaster bandages to reinforce the outer edge of the mold. Plaster works great on top of plaster. I don't have to do anything to prep the surface. It will automatically want to stick to itself. So I'm just using a little warm water, strips of plaster bandages. You can see that I'm folding them before I put them on so that I don't have any frayed edges at the edge of the mold. Rubbing it in really good to get a nice adhesion. And I'm also being careful not to get plaster inside the mold, because again, that is the part that we will be pressing the clay into. And the reality is, you could use another round of plaster bandages just on its own to reinforce the mold. You don't necessarily have to do the plaster. I just like to do the pottery plaster because it adds a little more strength and thickness, and the thicker that the mold is, the more moisture it can pull from the clay. But there's always usually more than one way to do the same job, so. Okay, and again, I'm being really careful on that top edge. Smoothing everything out. And we'll call it good. So I'm gonna leave this set for a couple days before I go to use it for a press mold. I want to make sure that you're keeping these things in mind when you go to clean up. Plaster never goes down your sink drain. You let the plaster settle to the bottom of the bucket overnight. You pour the water off the top the next day, wipe out the settled plaster and throw it away in a trash can. Then you can wipe your bucket with newspaper or a paper towel to get any extra scraps or bits out of there before you go to rinse it in a sink. Please be sure that you also rinse any tools right away, especially metal ones. And when you leave your mask to dry, leave it on a sheet of plastic. If you leave it on something that is metal, again, it could rust, or if you leave it on wood, you'll notice that the wood will become saturated with water. So keep it on plastic and have fun.